Week 2, Ethics in Research. The social researcher must always minimise the risk of harm to respondents in a research study. We must ensure there is no exploitation and preserve the anonymity of participants. We must avoid conflict in research. We need to work together with groups and individuals to devise, set and deliver on research agendas. We must be very sensitive to individual needs and at all times be respectful of the people who participate in a research study. Social research is almost always sensitive, and both the researcher and the people who are the subjects of the research have their own self-interest. It's difficult to remove the conscious and the unconscious biases that accompany this. Full disclosure of the potential use of the research is desirable, but it's not always possible. For example, if you're testing the merits of a service or a particular social policy against other services or policies, full disclosure may prejudice responses and thus have an artificial influence on potential outcomes. No matter how hard we try, our own prejudices and biases may influence the research participants' responses. And we need to be aware of that. Participation in research is always voluntary, and potential participants must be made aware of that. Thus, in research, we live by the mottos, do no harm, and follow ethical guidelines. There can always be uncomfortable situations in research. For example, mixing genders, age groups, ethnicities, and so on, when it's not appropriate to the topic being researched, can result in some discomfort. In research, we like to have groups which we call internally homogeneous and externally heterogeneous, which means that people within a particular group are similar to each other, but are also quite different from people in another group. Imagine if our research was about shopping for new clothes, for example, and we mixed some very different people, some very, very high income people and some very low income people who obviously have different shopping habits. Or if we were talking about diet and we included some very large and some very small people in the one group and then proceeded to question them on their eating habits. We must make sure that participants give their fully informed consent. They must be clear that they are participating in a social or marketing research exercise. They need to be reassured that there will be no personal follow-up. Or if this is part of a staged research process, then that must be made clear at the outset. They must also be reassured that their participation in the research will have no impact at all on their status, their benefits, their current living situation, or whatever. In research, there's always a power relationship. The researcher may be seen as the purveyor of the knowledge in comparison with the group being researched. This power relationship can result in the research subject in a very human way, seeking to provide the information he thinks is required of him, rather than giving honest answers to some questions. It's all too easy to be subjective when doing research, and as difficult as that may be, the researcher is required to strip him or herself of all subjectivities, religious, educational, class, political, moral, and so on. Thus, the researcher is required to be both objective in outlook and reflexive in interpretation. Research is a collaborative process. It's a collaboration between the sponsor of the research, the company or organisation or institution behind it who commissioned the research, the authorities in the field in which the research is being conducted, which could be a university department, a government department, a peak body, a company, an institute, a society, the researcher, and most importantly, the person involved in or the subject of the research. Research itself is guided by enforceable norms and ethical standards. Ultimately, the researcher is accountable to the above-mentioned bodies, to the subject of the research, and indeed to the general public. All of these have a legislated expectation of authentic and ethical research. In order to ensure that ethical standards are met, many studies are subject to approval by human research ethics committees. It is recommended that we study at least one of the following bodies' research standards documents: the National Health and Medical Research Council, which clearly is concerned with health-type research projects, the Australasian Association of Social Workers, the Code, which applies in the community services sector, the Australian Market and Social Research Society's Code of Professional Behaviour, which governs the behaviour of members of the Australian Market and Social Research Society, and as mentioned, the various university human research ethics committees. As an example, we've given an example of the AMSRS code and what it has to say about informed consent. It's quite wordy and complicated, but we need to work our way through it and make sure that we do understand what we need to be doing in this respect.